Sergeant Idris stepped through the side door of the hovering Valkyrie and into the night sky. He allowed his rappelling line to slither through the harness with practiced smoothness, his stomach dropping away while the lights of Radab Downhive wheeled below him. His boots hit the ferrocrete roof and he detached his line. An instant later, he was stood amongst the squad of Dantos Grenadiers, taking in every detail of his drop zone. 4 gunships hovered low over the roof of the Administratum Shrine, which jutted out like a prow from one end of the sprawling complex it oversaw. The Guild Grisalt Slaughterhouse, big as a district, complex as a maze. Not a single lumen lit the whole place. It spread out dark and silent below the drop zone rooftop, like a slumbering beast. In the squad of the Valkyrie's thrusters, 3 squads of veteran Dantosian soldiery had formed up. Alongside them had gathered another knot of personnel, whom Idris eyed with wary interest. Lieutenant Null, he knew, having served under her for going on 3 years across 7 war zones. Null was typically unflappable, a fixed point of glacial calm amidst even the worst firefights. Tonight, Idris thought she looked unsettled. He could sympathize. In place of Null's familiar command squad, towered the robe-swathed figure the Dantosians had been instructed to call Saint, and his gaggle of strange attendants. Idris had never seen such an odd collection of armored leather bodysuits, glowing goggles, mysterious augmetic armatures, gurgling fluid shunts, and baroque brass-chased equipment in all his days. "I don't know what the freak show are here for," he muttered to Corporal Harrell, "but I don't like it. It feels like a bad job, don't it, Sarge?" replied Harrell in his distinctive Valleylander drawl. Idris nodded to a trio of regimental priests huddled together near the corner of the roof. Sergeant Corton's squad had helped the holy men to rappel, white-knuckled, down to the roof. Now the trio clung to their religious paraphernalia and fought to keep their robes from whipping about in the downdraft. To Idris, they looked as out of place as a turd on a banqueting table. "Reckon they feel the same as us about it," he said. "This is soldiers' work." "What do we need priests for?" asked Harrell. "Who knows, Corporal? Perhaps this so-called saint is concerned for the good of our souls," replied Idris. Lieutenant Null finished her hushed exchange with the looming saint and turned to her assembled soldiers. Thrusters bellowed, then receded, as the Valkyries climbed away to begin a circling patrol. Idris tried not to think of them as carrion birds above a corpse, then frowned, wondering where such a macabre notion had come from. "Soldiers of Dantos, duty calls and we shall answer," Null began. "I am now at liberty to tell you that a substantial heretic cult has taken root within the depths of this complex. It is Saint's intention to expunge this infestation. We shall be his weapons of purification. Idris, your squad has point. Corton, your rear guard. Sav, you and yours will stay central and act as ready reserve. Meanwhile, Saint assures me that he and his operatives will handle any heretical witchery that may be forthcoming. Mission is a kill sweep. No mercy, no survivors. Questions?" Idris glanced at Harrell, saw that he too had heard the lieutenant's hesitation on the word witchery. He considered asking for more details on the nature of the deviants that they might expect. A glance at the cowled Saint looming behind Null told Idris he would be unlikely to receive any meaningful answers. "Any foresight on the enemy numbers or armaments, ma'am?" asked Sergeant Sav. "We expect substantial presence but poor quality heretic dregs. Nothing to challenge good Dantos Grenadiers," Null replied. "Time is not our ally," came a rumbling voice. It took Idris a moment to realize that it emerged from the deep shadows of Saint's cowl. "You heard him," Null said. "Sergeant Idris, breach and clear. The rest of you, follow up and watch our flanks. The Emperor protects, ladies and gentlemen." Idris's disquiet grew at how easily his lieutenant had been pushed to haste. Just who was this Saint? And what were they doing here anyway? Why send veteran infantry to root out cultists? Wasn't that what enforcers were for? If life in the Imperial Guard had taught Sergeant Idris anything, however, it was that asking unwanted questions never led to anything good. Instead, he gestured to the men and women of his squad to proceed. Grenadiers Polda and Cratch moved to the armored access hatch, set into the center of the roof. Unhitching las torches from their webbing, the two veterans muttered prayer of ignition and set to work on the hatch. The blue flames of the torches threw stark shadows across the rooftop, and Idris had a sudden sense of a wrongness in their shape. They writhed in the corners of his eyes, jagged and somehow too large. Instinctively, Idris glanced aside. Seen dead on, the shadows were only that. Shadows of soldiers. He thought he felt Saint's eyes upon him from within that darkened cowl, and looked hurriedly back to Polda and Cratch. The two troopers rose, hitching their cutters back to the webbing and hefting their las guns. "Breaching," said Polda, raising one booted foot and kicking the hatch inward. The metal slab clanged against the stairs below and tumbled away. Idris winced at the din, feeling suddenly as though breaking the silence within constituted a transgression. Then he was moving, training taking over as Polda and Cratch led the way down the stairs with las guns raised. Idris went after them, Corporal Harrell and the rest of the squad on his heels. Below lay a spread of Spartan administratum offices and scriptoriums wreathed in shadow and silence. As the squad advanced, covering angles through arched doorways and between parchment-heaped desks, Harrell gestured at the ceiling lumen. Idris frowned, seeing every bulb blackened as though blown out by a surge of motive force. "Lanterns," he ordered. Beams of light cut the still air as his squad raised the light packs strapped to their las guns. The sergeant and his squad spread out, covering all movement, smooth and efficient. Behind them, the rest of the force entered the offices. "Move down and press east," ordered Saint in that same bass rumble. "They will be concentrated around the fane this night that lies at the heart of this complex." Wondering how the mysterious giant knew this, Idris shot hand signals to his squad to obey. The Dantosians slipped like wraiths from one office cell to the next until Polda located a circular stone stairwell. Idris was about to take the first step down into the spiraling darkness when the Voxman Thedek spoke up. He sounded unnerved. "Sergeant, there's something on the Vox." Instinct told Idris to glance back to whether Lieutenant Null was sending or receiving. When he saw her doing neither, but instead returning a questioning look, he turned to Thedok. "Define something, Voxman." "Think you best take heed for yourself, Sarge," said Thedok. Impatient to keep moving, Idris nonetheless took the proffered headset and held it to one ear. His skin prickled as sibilant whispers and glottal muttering crawled into his ear. Idris felt hot and cold all at once. Nausea turned over in his gut. He met Thedok's eyes, saw his unease mirrored there. From behind came a rising metallic clatter, mingled with a whistle like steam from a boiler. Idris looked to see one of Saint's retinue pointing at the Vox set, mouth stretched in a dark O. The noise came from a bizarre mass of dials and valves grafted onto the side of the man's skull. Several bulbs set into the black leather of his chest had lit up an angry red. "Disable all Vox," ordered Saint in a tone that brooked no disagreement. Thedek and the other squad's Voxmen obeyed at once. Idris, both hands back on his gun, stalked down the stairwell behind Polda and Cratch. As his footfalls echoed weirdly around him, he tried and failed to banish the word that sprung in the back of his mind. Witchery. They descended past several more floors of nondescript cubicles before passing through a metal archway. This brought Idris and his soldiers out onto a metal gantry, running west to east through a cavernous chamber. A glance over the rail suggested a drop of at least 50 feet, down onto the machinery of an industrial killing floor. "Push east, cover the angles, watch your footing," Idris ordered. His grenadiers obeyed, and soon found themselves advancing between ceiling conveyors from whose chain hooks dangled hundreds of Grox carcasses. "Smell like they've been here a while," said Harrell, face creased in disgust. Idris was about to respond but froze, staring at a nearby carcass. Surely it had been swinging in the breeze. Surely, he had hoped, it hadn't squirmed like a worm on a hook. "Sergeant?" asked Polda, who had stopped ahead of him. Idris glanced her way and gave a bark of surprise and recoiled against the railing. Grenadier Polda's features were a mask of rotted meat, one eye hanging like a bulbous sack from its socket. Fat maggots spilling from a gaping hole where nose and mouth should have been. "Sergeant," she asked again, and then all of their light packs blinked off at once. The next few seconds felt to Idris like the longest of his life. The savior rail groaned as his heart leapt through his mouth as he imagined plunging down onto the spikes and blades below. Voices cried out, but they sounded wrong. Hoarse and rasping or clotted with fluids. From all around came the rattle of chains, as though what hung from them was writhing and dancing with a terrible eagerness. Again, there came a clatter and whistle of bizarre machinery, this time mingled with a bellows wheeze, followed by a moaning voice that uttered something like prayers. A lasgun discharged with a flash. "In the God Emperor's name, spirits, I deny thee." Saint's voice cut through the bedlam, accompanied by a pressure wave that made Idris's ears pop. In its wake, the stains chilled their rattling. One by one, the lights on the soldiers' guns flickered back to life. Idris exhaled as he saw Polda's bewildered features were free of corruption. "What in the name of the throne?" began Lieutenant Null, but Saint spoke over her. "Portenta premalignor. The veil thins, Lieutenant. I did not think. No matter. What is. Haste, all of you. Lest we arrive too late. Priests, your prayers may shield us. Raise your voices in praise unceasing." The three preachers did as bidden, hesitant at first, but gaining confidence until their words rang through the cavernous space in holy exhortation. "Advance! Double time! Weapons roused!" barked the lieutenant. Idris, glad of something concrete and rational, obeyed. Dantosian boots rang against the swaying gantry as he and his soldiers jogged eastward, and as they went, he did his best to banish the supernatural horrors of the last minutes from his mind. He reached for anger, hoping to use it to scour away his fear. Some witch had gotten into his mind, and he would exact revenge for that violation. More corridors led on from the gantry. Then more spiraling stone stairways, coiling down to a network of brushed steel halls, and chambers lined with blackened lumen sconces. They all looked alike to Idris. He found himself checking his handheld auspex with increasing regularity. He turned a corner into another corridor and pulled up short. Idris scowled down at the map readout on his device, then back up at the solid metal wall that should not have been there. He noted the patina of rust clinging to the metal, suggesting it had been there a long while and had not been well maintained. "Back up, map error," he snapped, retreating to the cross corridor they had just passed. "Sergeant?" asked Null, and he was about to suggest they try the northward passage, when he saw with increasing alarm that it too was nothing but a rusted wall. Saint swept past them. His retinue had formed up around him and had an arsenal of weird-looking weapons at hand. "Fallible human senses will not serve this close to the epicenter," Saint threw back over his shoulder. "Follow, and stay close if you do not wish to be forever lost." Idris did not feel inclined to argue, and from the haste with which his comrades followed the robed giant, neither did they. For all their veterancy, the Dantosians bunched close as though for mutual reassurance, and almost all of them were now muttering their own prayers to the Emperor. Idris was no exception. As they hastened through the disorienting maze, he tried hard not to think about the sights he saw. Some corridors seemed to stretch away for miles, vanishing in impossibly distant dots of sickly light. Others were furred with centuries of rust and bulbous fungi, across which scuttled things with too many legs and pallid bodies that looked on the verge of bursting. A stench hung thick in the air. Idris's lungs felt hot, and sweat prickled his brow, as though he was sickening with something. The sergeant was just about to voice his growing fear that the cultists had released a viral weapon, when Saint led them down a sloping corridor and halted before a sagging pair of metal double doors that were rusted shut. "Be ready, all of you, and remember that the Emperor protects," he said. "Whatever you see beyond this door, understand that it is but the illusion of witchery. Slay your foes, whatever form they might appear to take. Do not falter." Before any of the Dantosians could raise a voice in protest or caution, Saint cast aside his robes. A towering figure was revealed. Not the bulk of a space marine, but rather the elongated form of one who had undergone strange and extensive augmentations. Saint wore ornate golden armor, painted with complex hexagrams, and a closed helm with a blank metal faceplate. From somewhere, a long silver sword had appeared in his double-handed grip. At a nod from their master, Saint's retinue swung power hammers into the doors and stove them inward. The reek that rolled out through the sundered portal hit Idris like a physical blow. Some of the Dantosians staggered back and vomited explosively. The rest stared through the portal, frozen in horror at the sight now revealed. Perhaps this had once been a chamber like the rest, a physical space in which the shadowy suggestions of metal pews and some manner of altars still lingered. Yet it shuddered before Idris's eyes, reeling in and out of focus, overlaid with a nightmarish double image. The floor both was and was not flooded with rancid mud that did and did not pop and bubble, as finger-thick worms seethed through it. Rag-robed corpses lay everywhere, both submerged beneath the filth and rot, simultaneously appearing newly dead yet also furred with green mold, and sprouting man-high fungi, rippling with screaming human faces. Something like a fanged and grotesquely bloated tree grew where the altar had been, the bells that did and did not festoon its unbranches tolling mournfully in a spore-thick breeze that blew from nowhere. Worse of all, where there should have been and still were walls, there was also a vista of ghastly swampland and mutant underbrush so foul that Idris's mind refused to make sense of it. Wading towards them, through the miasmal clouds of the impossible swamp, were rotting humanoid figures. Their cyclopean eyes stared, their voices were raised in a croaking mantra of ceaseless counting. Several of Idris's soldiers crumbled, collapsing into the unreal mire, as though their hearts or minds had given way. For his part, the sergeant had just enough wherewithal to shout a single word: "Fire!" He squeezed his trigger, and his surviving soldiers followed suit. Las blasts flickered. Their first volley peppered the nearest of the approaching monsters. Some blew clots of rancid flesh from the creatures' frames, while others had passed straight through them, as though they weren't there. "Sarge, what? Harold's voice was a half-sob and contained a pleading note. "Illusion. Witchery. Gotta be," the sergeant replied, and barely recognized his own wet croak of a voice. He blinked crusted eyes and tried to ignore the pustules breaking out across his hands, the rust tendrils crawling across his lasgun. "All just illusion and witchery," he told himself. "Don't think, keep shooting." Saint had waded into the deformed chamber, and his silver sword flashed as he hacked at the advancing monsters, while roaring strange words. Sigils glowed into being in the air around him, spinning like ethereal gears and coiling out to bind and then dissolve groaning entities. Around him, his retinue unleashed arcs of searing energy and bursts of magnesium-white flame from their weapons, while at their backs the priests advanced, praying fervently. At the doorway, Sergeants Cortan and Sav pushed their soldiers up to join the firing line, bawling at them to focus, to pray, and for the throne's sake to keep shooting. For a moment, Idris felt a surge of fervent hope. One by one, the monsters were falling. As they did, the stigmas of sickness he saw in his flesh flickered as though they were truly just an illusion. When the monsters surfaced beneath Saint and his followers, it came up like a submerged island dredged from the deeps. Idris had an impression of yard upon yard of diseased green flesh and rancid fat, of rotted muscle and fanged imps that clung to the emerging mass and cackled like spiteful infants. He saw a distended jaw yawn impossibly wide, saw the golden armor and bright silver blade of Saint vanish into a gullet as though into an infernal abyss. Then the monster was looming above them, head thrown back, throat bulging as it swallowed the man who had led them into this nightmare. The thing looked down at Saint's scattered followers, already vanishing under a tide of its scrabbling plague mites. It gave a deep wet chuckle, and turned its ancient yellow-eyed gaze upon the quailing Dantosians. By the time it opened its rotted jaws to laugh, and the ceiling tore away amidst a vortex of lurid green lightning and thrumming plague flies, Sergeant Idris's sanity had fled, and his gun had fallen from palisade and rotting hands. It was, perhaps, an emperor sent mercy that he had not the wit remaining to understand what happened next. At first glance, it might seem that few mortal beings would choose to worship Nurgle. and that those who do must surely be mad. The ragged preachers of Nurgle's feculent faith cannot promise martial might on a par with that embodied by Khorne. They do not offer the boundless cunning and sorcerous potency of Tzeentch, nor even the hedonistic pleasures or obsessive fulfillments of Slaanesh. Nurgle's remit is plague. His boons are in themselves supernatural maladies, demonic parasites, and disfiguring mutations. Who but a nihilistic lunatic would willingly offer worship to the author of such woes? Yet disease, decay, entropy, and the despair that they bring are the fundamental facts of populations and armies across the galaxy. On world after world, crops fail, food spoils, and sickness and starvation follow. Overcrowded field hospitals are hotbeds for swift-spreading infections and feeding grounds for rapacious parasites, languishing in foetid slums, pinned down and wounded amidst the contaminating filth of no man's land, ravaged by noxious bioweapons and alien phages. Souls beyond number confront the inescapable fact of their own mortality. Some cling to faith and hope until the last. Most pass beyond the limits of their endurance and cry out in their delirium for salvation, no matter its source. Whether they suffer until the end or their will gives way, they all empower the plague god. It is said by the worshippers of Nurgle that for all the cruelties he heaps upon real space, he is at heart a fond-hearted and grandfatherly deity. There are few whose supplication he would refuse, nor deny his rancid gifts. Thus the worshippers of Nurgle became willing hosts for all his most grotesque contagions, precisely in order to survive their touch, that which would otherwise be their destroyer, becoming one with it, and glorying in the unholy vitality and resilience such a gruesome bargain grants. Each mortal who makes this pact becomes another vector for Nurgle's supernatural contagions, and another catalyst to furthering the Grandsire's power. In truth, succumbing to the worship of Nurgle is indeed a kind of madness. His mortal worshippers exult in all the repugnant signs of disease and mutation that should instinctively repel them. They willingly spread his plagues far and wide, even to comrades in arms or loyal friends they would previously have sought to protect. They willingly spread his plagues far and wide, even to comrades in arms and loyal friends they would previously have sought to protect. They do this in the certainty that they are sharing Nurgle's priceless gifts, echoing their deity's boundless generosity. The most fervent of Nurgle's mortal worshippers recognize that even amidst the misery of disease and the ruination of decay, new life is born. Squirming parasites and filth-grubbing nematodes, grotesque spore-spewing fungi, clouds of flies vast and dense as thunderheads, mutant viral strains of ravenous bacteria, all such progeny of rot proliferate where Nurgle's touch is felt. And with that, let's go to the spinny shots. My friends, welcome back for a long one this time. I found this awesome story in the 9th edition Demon's Codex that I absolutely had to share. Because, you know, the demon models are awesome, demon lore is great, but I think what really gets it, you know, I mean, I am a sucker for horror movies, but what really gets it is when you see it, the demons from the human point of view. And when it's really that good, unknowable, Lovecraftian horror, that is really my favorite type of 40k. Really just my favorite parts of the whole universe. Like, I'll talk about how much I love orcs and how fun they are, but this is really it to me. So, if you hung around for this long, thank you so much, and if you want to hang out with me while I paint things live on Twitch, you can find me at twitch.tv/drinkyourpaintwaterlive. There will be a link down in the description. Also, let me know what you think about longer stories like this. Do you guys prefer the short 10-minute snippets, or would you prefer the longer, like an actual story type of thing? Hit me up with some comments down below with all that. And with that, I'll see you in the next one.